Welcome to Security Take 2. I'm Chester Wisniewski, and I'm here with my co-host, Ben Verscharen.
This is episode 9. Today we're going to be talking about LulzSec. It is the 30th of June, 2025. I actually think we should be calling this episode the 50 Days of LulzSec, Chet, because in my research for this one, a lot happened within a 50-day period, right?
Holy cow. I think it should be called the 50 Days of Research. It's been about 50 days since our last episode, and we agreed that this was going to be the topic, and I just keep stumbling across things, and as we record, it's Sunday here in Vancouver, and I spent the day looking for my copy of a book that had a bunch of reference material that I wanted to use for the episode, because I all these memories are coming back. This was such an unbelievable 50 days, to be honest. When we think about all the other types of cybercrimes that we cover, it's both rare in its length, both for shortness and for longness, right? Like we think about most breaches and we talk about them for a day or two and they're gone. But when we talk about APT groups or other types of organized activity, or even things like anonymous, which we're going to talk a lot about in this episode, these are often multi-year conversations, right? And so it's kind of odd that it's been narrowed down to these 50 chaotic days, and boy, were they full of chaos.
And that's what's wild, is like LulzSec is still a common name. Like I forget half the APT names. Is it APT 49? Is it Scattered Spider? Is it whatever? I know very clearly who LulzSec are, and I wasn't even working in cybersecurity at that point. So to go through all of this in detail, we'll do our best, I guess, is probably the best thing to say, right, Chet?
Yeah. Well, and what is exactly a member of LulzSec? Kind of people come and go a little bit in these groups. I mean, I think it's fair to classify them in the bucket of hacktivists. So whenever we talk about hacktivists, it's a little bit ill-defined precisely what is a member of Anonymous. We are a legion. I mean, anybody's anonymous. Everybody's anonymous. I mean, in the case of LulzSec, there was a little bit of a closer definition, but depending on who you asked, I mean, there was anywhere from 6 to 11 members, because many people contributed in their own hacktivist ways to help advance the LulzSec cause, if you were, but maybe weren't core members. So we probably, for the sake of definition in the podcast, we would call it, I guess, the core 6. And then there's sort of all these associated people that kind of were involved as well, that may have did some time for their crimes, but perhaps didn't have LulzSec embroidered on their shirt.
Yeah, it's a fair thing to say. Before we go through those people, though, it's worth noting the reason why we're talking about Anonymous as well is LulzSec is considered a splinter group or an offshoot of Anonymous, and that's how a lot of these people initially came together. So I agree with you. Who is Anonymous? Well, the whole thing was that everybody's supposed to be anonymous. LulzSec was this splinter group of people that worked well together, and as a result, we ended up with 6 or 7 characters. So LulzSec was led by Hector Monsiga, also known as Sabu. He was 28 years old at the time. And then we had Ryan Ackroyd, also known as Kayla. Interestingly enough, I heard in a podcast that a lot of people had a crush on Kayla, assuming that she was this young, vibrant, amazing hacker, and it turned out to be a then 25-year-old male in London that went by the name Kayla. We had Jack Davis, also known as Topiary. I think I mispronounced that. I do apologize. He was 19, of Shetland in the UK. Darren Martin, also known as Porn Sauce, who was 25, and I don't know how to say the next name. Donacha Karabali? Did I get that wrong, Chet?
No, I'm my Irish. I do not speak Irish, and so we'll just have to go with Palladium.
Palladium, yeah, 19 of Ireland. And then there was Avi Unit, who we still don't know who that is. And then there was T-Flow, Mustafa Al-Bassem. At the time, he was 16 and wasn't named in any of the legal filings. I'm happy to say his name now, purely because he's openly come out to say, I am T-Flow, and he's done a lot of public interviews and is very open about his past. And then there was a few other characters that kind of floated around.
Yeah, there's a couple others I'll have on my list that were sort of affiliated enough that I kind of threw them into the bucket, if you will. We had and our chaos. Jeremy Hammond from Chicago, quite famous for hacking Stratfor as part of Anonymous, a defense contractor, I guess you would call them intelligence provider in the United States, and also Ryan Cleary, known as Viral, and Cleary was from Essex and was part of the attacks on the United States Air Force, which again, few interesting notes I had on some of these folks that you had mentioned that stood out to me. We're going to go obviously pretty deep on particularly probably Sabu and Topiary, who were two of the most public figures and were very central to much of the story. But there was a couple other interesting things. Pwn Sauce was actually the head of the local OWASP chapter, which is a web security organization that many of our listeners may be part of. I've certainly been a guest speaker at a few OWASP chapter meetings, and I never thought, like, is the leader of this chapter meeting a member of Anonymous who's been on a hacking spree of terror? It's kind of odd to think of your local OWASP chapter that way, at least the ones I've met. And you mentioned Topiary, and Topiary, I think, really caught the world's attention probably before was a member of LulzSec, but the Westboro Baptist Church in the United States is a very racist and homophobic organization hiding as a church, and is quite well disliked by all free-thinking people that care about freedom of speech and freedom of body and behavior. And he was involved in hacking them live while in an interview on CNN with the Westboro Baptist Church, and was breaking into their systems during the CNN interview. You just can't make this stuff up. It's depending how you feel about hacktivist crimes, some of the victims are hard to love in these cases.
Yeah, I totally agree. And this is the thing, is like, if you go, the footage of the CNN interview is on YouTube, and it's hilarious to watch. I thoroughly enjoy that. And it's not to say that I support, hacktivism or hacking, but some of the causes were noble. What I find interesting, though, with LulzSec, and this is worth talking about, is Anonymous had a bunch of rules, and there was rules of engagement. They only believed that they were going after people that they believe deserve to get hacked and exposed. And if you look at a few of the online interviews with LulzSec, they actually talk about some of the operations that they did, like with Tunisia, as being their most proud moments. And these were actual hacks that they did with Anonymous. When Sabu decided to start LulzSec, it's because he didn't want the guardrails. He didn't want to have this noble hacktivism cause. He wanted to do it for the lulz, and they wanted to go after more victims than just what the collective mind at Anonymous deemed to be a worthy target.
So I guess that was the precursor here, right, Ben? I mean, the precursor in particular were two attacks that the core members of LulzSec were involved in and sort of orchestrated under the brand of Anonymous. Op Tunisia, which was part of the Arab Spring, and the other one was the H.B. Gary federal attack on Aaron Barr, which I'll save some of that for a future episode. We'll have a guest on and talk a little bit about that one maybe down the road. I've got some stories about the H.B. Gary federal situation, but nonetheless, those two, or where these core members met, conducting those under the banner of Anonymous, and then made this choice that you're talking about of kind of going off in a proper, we're just gonna name and shame and do this for the shits and giggles, right? I mean, I've decided this episode has an explicit tag, so we're gonna go for it now. And yeah, well, let's. So after Op Tunisia and after HB Gary Federal, they decided to kind of form this group. So that was what, April 2011. It sounds like Topiary and Sabu got together, get the team back together. We just had these great successes and these very public hacks. Let's get the best of the best together and go off and call ourselves a new thing. And I think it took them a little while to ultimately decide on the name for the new group. They'd tossed around several different names, including one of my favorite ones that was sort of playing into the weird seafaring theme that came out later of lulzboat. Although they didn't stick with that because they couldn't get the handle or something. And or oh no, I think in fact I think Topiary had created the Twitter handle for it and then forgot the password. And so they just gave up on it and changed names and ultimately decided on calling themselves LulzSec. And but I think what put them on the radar, certainly for me, was in May when they hacked the PlayStation Network and compromised the personal and financial details of 75 million people. I think the attack was in mid-April, but it became public in May that this had happened, and like it was a massive black mark on Sony. And you might say like, well, what is the hacktivist thing in attacking Sony? Like, what were you after? And for those of you that are old enough to remember a lot of the things going on in 2011 in the hacktivist world, they were mad about George Hotz. George Hotz, who was known as Geo Hotz, had hacked the PlayStation and determined the like encryption key that allowed you to write software and get the PlayStation to accept it as being legitimate PlayStation software. So in essence, jailbroke the PlayStation. And Sony immediately, rather than like responsibly respond, publish a firmware update, work with the hacker to figure out what they did. Instead, they sued George Hotz. And that made the hacktivist community very angry at Sony.
It's funny because Nintendo is going through something very similar at the moment. I don't want to digress too much, but yeah, and people were livid about it at the time, and with Nintendo now, people are still livid with it. It's like they haven't learned from their past mistakes on how to handle these situations. Not to victim blame here, but that was 75 million PlayStation Network accounts, chat, and that included usernames, passwords, but also financial details as well. That was actually a pretty severe breach. And what I don't like about this one, and this is where hacktivism maybe goes a little bit too far, is the victim here wasn't Sony, it was the PlayStation users, right?
Well, this was the second time in as many a couple years that Sony had been victimized for having, and Sony will come up later in this conversation as well. Unfortunately, they've got a bit of a checkered security past, but this is the problem with all of these data leaks: is the victims are both the organization that you targeted, but also the innocent employees. Well, maybe you can decide if the employees are innocent or not, but I would say most of the time the employees are innocent. The customers, a lot of our information is held by these organizations, including my information was in that PlayStation Network stuff. I had specifically bought a PlayStation. I was angry at Sony at the same time because I had bought a PS3 because Sony had a Linux Penguin on the box and promised that I could run Linux on it. It was really cool, and I thought, wow, what a cool way to get another computer that runs Linux and play with it. And then they took that away from me a couple of years later after the George Hotz situation because they were worried that it was going to get hacked again. And the whole thing was a lie. I spent money on a Linux computer that was no longer a Linux computer. But again, that's another tangent. This podcast could be so full of tangents. It's hard to not go down them all. But clearly, I was victimized by Sony. George Haas was victimized by Sony, you could argue. And certainly, the 75 million people's information were victimized, maybe you could say, by both Sony and LulzSec.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, like, their spree continued. And it's worth noting, they then went after Fox. And they mostly dumped the victims of the TV talent show, The X Factor. Now, I will say, one of my favorite folk musicians, he has a line in one of his songs about thanking X Factor for destroying music. So I can see why hacktivism would get involved. But interestingly enough, listening to a few podcasts with members from LulzSec, that on May 7th, when they dumped the Fox.com TV talent show X Factor contestant list, it actually received very little publicity, which apparently angered and really frustrated the group, which I found interesting. Is they thought that this would be a high profile breach, and it didn't eventuate to that until people really started to put together that LulzSec was involved with all of these breaches and really started to talk about the 50 days of LulzSec.
Well, the next one really was disappointing to me. So I grew up in the United States, and I don't admit that publicly often considering the current situation, but it is truth. And as a child in the United States, I was a gigantic fan of public television growing up with Sesame Street and many of the other fantastic programs that the American Public Television Network produces. And the LulzSec guys got mad at them because they were talking trash, I think, about WikiLeaks. Well, I won't say they were talking trash. They were literally published a documentary on WikiLeaks on public television. And because the members of LulzSec were fans of Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks, and again, a topic for perhaps another tangent podcast in the future, because Assange is a complicated character to support or to attack. But nonetheless, they were upset about that, decided they were going to hack public TV, and they broke into the CMS for the website PBS NewsHour, which is their national evening news television program, and posted a joke story. Topiary posted a joke story about Tupac Shakur being found alive. I'm like, just, it was clearly meant to be, just funny and demonstrating how terrible PBS or public television security was. But, not for profit entities designed to do things to benefit and inform the public doesn't feel terribly ethical in the hacktivist mantra of just for the lulz that was portrayed or certainly proclaimed by members of LulzSec.
No, so just for the record, apparently Tupac was alive in New Zealand, so just a stone throw from me, which, didn't end up happening. But then...
He was probably at Kim.com's compound, right? I mean, why not?
Let's not start any rumors on this podcast, yeah? So, but potentially. But that's actually, it was during that time as well that there was talk of like having a second tier network of what was described as like additional hackers that were friends of Sabu that would also help them. But this was much bigger and got much more publicity than the X Factor breach did. So, you compound Sony with then the PBS NewsHour program, all of a sudden there's a bit more notoriety going on there as well. So then on June 2nd, 2011, they announced a second attack on SonyPictures.com. The group claimed that they compromised 1 million of the site's users. There was talk of Sony network maps. The developer source code was claimed in a news article by Routers. So there was a second attack on Sony pretty much a month after the first one was announced.
Well, let's go back 24 hours then to the evening, or perhaps not even 24 hours, maybe 12 hours. Let's go back to the evening of June 1st, 2011. I had been writing for nearly full time at that time for our blog at the company I work for at Sophos, and our blog was quite well known at that time as a news blog called Naked Security for hacks and security incidents and these types of things. And as a somewhat well-known person on Twitter affiliated with the blog, I had someone, air quote, anonymously, to play off anonymous, reach out to me on Twitter that there was going to be some big news the next day about Sony Pictures being hacked. And I got this DM and I responded to the person and I was like, why should I believe you? We don't publicize these types of things. We're not in the business of making people famous for committing crimes. Why are you reaching out to me? And, why should I believe you? And the person's just like, I'm just giving you a heads up that it might be tomorrow's story. And you might want to check out Sony Pictures Italy, Sony Pictures, I think it was Serbia, I forget, and the third one was Sony Pictures UK. And I was like, okay, check it out. What do you mean, check it out? And they're like, basic SQL injection, shoddy security, Sony's still up to their old things. This, their credit cards were hacked a few years ago. They were hacked a month ago. This will just be more, on Sony. And I was like, okay, whatever. I don't know what this is about, but I'm certainly not going to promote or advertise this behavior and encourage bad things to happen. So out of curiosity, though, I went to Sony Pictures Italy's website And uh, I go to the search box on the main page of Sony Pictures Italy, and I don't speak Italian, but I can tell where the search box is. And I type in backtick or 1 = 1 semicolon. And the entire database of every login and customer account on the Sony Pictures website dumped into my web browser. And I was like, oh no. First, I have to call the lawyers. But like, this is a problem. They're not kidding. Whoever's sending this to me, I'm still not going to promote it, but whoever's sending this to me isn't kidding. This is at maybe 11 p.m. Pacific time in Canada here, UTC -7 in June. And I'm like, oh crap, like they're going to be a headline tomorrow if I don't try to do something. So I'm calling the switchboard at Sony Pictures Italy at 7 or 8 in the morning, trying to reach somebody in IT, and I can't get a hold of anybody, and they don't speak very good English, and I'm getting nowhere. And finally, I get a person that calls me back a half an hour later. It's probably a couple hours. It was like 2 in the morning. I get a phone call back, like from an IT person going, all of our IT is handled by all of Europe for Sony is handled by Sony Pictures UK. So I contact Sony Pictures UK. It's like another hour. I go to bed and I get a phone call waking me up at 3:30 in the morning. What are you talking about? And I start telling them like SQL injection attack, LulzSec, all this stuff, and kind of unloaded on them. And that was that. But that was a little too personal for me. And this is one of the weird things about being a public figure in information security can make you, which is potentially a mouthpiece for criminal activity, but it, depending where your ethics lie, kind of drags you into the middle of it.
I'm mind blown right now. I was a naked security listener and reader back then. I've known you for 10 years and I've never heard this story before. So I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. That is truly wild. But okay, sorry, I'm digesting everything that I just listened to. That's crazy. But let's talk about something you mentioned there. So you went to their website, you typed in backtick 1 = 1, and you discovered SQL injection, or someone told you SQL injection was there. It's worth noting, and I really want to emphasize this. If you look at what LulzSec was doing, even if you look at what Anonymous were doing, they were not sophisticated cyber attacks. And I say sophisticated, in air quotes, because that's what the news likes to portray now. But what I mean by that is this is basic web vulnerability stuff. You don't find a lot of these vulnerabilities anymore that are just so blatantly out there. Like, we've got so many web frameworks available now. There's so much back-end sanitization. There's so much front-end sanitization. What they were going after really was low-hanging fruit. Like, it is not hard to mass scan the internet. And there's tools. Like, if you download Kali Linux, you can mass scan the internet. You can use tools like WP scan to scan, say, WordPress vulnerabilities and discover vulnerabilities really quick. These kinds of attacks are less and less. If you compare LulzSec to, say, the current wave of ransomware operators, the attack vectors are completely different. They are not at all alike. It's every now and then maybe there's an SQL injection vulnerability that is like blatantly obvious that someone will use to get remote code to execute, or they'll use to, say, compromise credentials and use that to then, access a VPN concentrated to get access to a network. But that is kind of rare. So if you look at what LulzSec was doing, compare it to today, their success, I believe, in 2025, as we record, would be a lot lower than what it was back then. It was kind of that age of the internet in 2011, 2010, where web apps were still blatantly vulnerable. You saw people coding that didn't know what they were doing, though in saying that, with AI, there's a lot of vibe coding going on, and we may actually end up in this era again, but podcast for another day. But what I'm trying to say is the sophistication wasn't really there. This is like low-hanging fruit 101 pen testing stuff that should get addressed now during the development cycle. Would you agree?
Well, having been around a lot longer than you, I don't know that it's any better now. It's just different.
Okay.
we're making new and different mistakes. I mean, you mentioned Kali. Well, back then it was called Backtrack, and it was still available, and all these tools were available to anyone. And it's not, without victim blaming is really hard in this story. because the type of SQL injection that I accidentally stumbled across, which I honestly didn't believe was true, which is why I stumbled across it, because when I was told this, I'm like, well, it can't be that easy. And it was. And by the way, kids, for those of you, especially if you work for an organization, when this happens, you now have other people's personal information. You need to call your lawyers, which is what I had to do. It's not a good day. You don't want to do this on a lark. And the only reason I did it was I didn't think it was going to work. Like, even then, it shouldn't have worked, right? The level of negligence in maintaining a website that had vulnerabilities that have been widely known and promoted in the 1990s should not have been available in 2011 on Fortune 1000 organization websites. And I'll just leave it at that. And you can draw your own conclusions about people's competence. LulzSec was on a roll, though. And they rolled right into the next day, the 3rd of June 2011, and defaced the website of the InfraGard chapter in Atlanta, Georgia. Now, for those of you that are not in the United States and not involved with law enforcement, InfraGard is a sort of a user group for the FBI and the private sector to get together and chat about securing critical infrastructure. Almost every FBI field office in the United States has an InfraGard chapter. They invite people like myself and Ben, were we in the United States, to attend those kinds of meetings and talk about threat intelligence, talk about what they're seeing, and establish relationships with the private sector to help improve security. So a direct attack on the federal police in the United States, kind of escalating the whole movement into a new realm of not just Sony and public television, but the government and the cops.
Yeah, but to go back to what we were just saying, so from that attack, there's like less than 200 users credentials lost, right? Like, it wasn't huge. The website was defaced as well, though, but it was still kind of minimal. It wasn't. I
It
wouldn't
was
be concerned
minimal,
about
but it was
200.
on the nose, right? I mean, federal police agents' username and passwords is perhaps drawing a bit of attention from the federal law enforcement agency that ultimately is going to put many of you in prison.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. So skipping forward, because this timeline, we could be here all day. I think it was June 7th. 2 FBI
Oh no, you
agents.
can't skip the 6th though, because the 6th, LulzSec, somebody donated 400 bitcoins, and to put that in perspective, today I checked, 400 bitcoins, if LulzSec had them, were worth 43.3 million US dollars. They got a $43 million donation in 2025 money. At
Yeah.
that time, it was $7,800, which still, I mean, $7,800, to be fair, considering the circumstances of many of these individuals, was a fair bit of cash. But like, if you had those bitcoins from June 6, 2011, LulzSec, $43 million.
I wonder where those bitcoins are now. Were they seized, or is it still sitting there in a wallet
I
lost
have
forever?
no idea. I would love to know if they've been spent. So go
I
ahead.
wonder.
7th of June. Fine, go ahead.
No, sorry. I wasn't going to bring up the bitcoins, but I'm glad you did, because I actually had the same thought, and I frantically started Googling as soon as you started to talk about it. You know, how much is that worth in today's money? I wouldn't say no. 2 FBI agents visit Hector or Sabu at his home in New York. And that's when, and this is worth noting, so Hector Monsiga, or Sabu, however you want to call him, he lived in New York. Now, it's interesting. LulzSec said that they were in it for the lulz. But here we have Hector, or Sabu, threatened to be in prison for 2 years for stealing credit cards and information that he doesn't actually own and shouldn't have. So when they came to his New York apartment, and they didn't have anything to prove necessarily that he was the leader of LulzSec at that point, but they did come and arrest him for stealing stealing credit card information, and that's what led to him becoming an informant. Now, it's worth noting there, and I'm not jumping to his defense yet. Don't worry. He was the sole carer for his 2 young nieces. He was unemployed at the time and did need money. Obviously, if he hadn't have been caught, he would have had 400 bitcoins to play with. But so the way that he was generating income from everything that I've read was selling stolen information, which is what he was originally arrested for. And instead of going to prison, he became an FBI informant at this point.
Yeah, we can loop back to that in the end to kind of talk a little bit more about both what happened to folks and who ratted on whom or what they were up to and that kind of thing. But the key point here is they were able to flip him into being an informant because of other crimes, right? They what led them to his house was he had logged into the IRC channel where they were planning all these operations once without a VPN, and so
Mm-hmm.
they had circumstantial evidence that he was involved in the group, but they didn't have enough to arrest him on that. But when they looked into him, they discovered this selling of these credit cards, and they went, okay, now we have an actual crime. We can flip him into an informant.
Yeah. So he was offline for about 48 hours while he went through that process, which, from what everybody was saying, was really unusual for him. But then Topiary managed to make contact with him. Sabu or Hector said that his grandmother had passed away and he just wasn't going to be online for the next couple of days. Interested in talking, like hearing interviews from the members now. They did say that his behavior changed when he came back online as well. He was clearly he was asking them questions like, "Can you confirm that you hacked this target on this date?" And in hindsight, they're all like, "Oh, that was obvious that he was flipped as an informant from that date onwards." But at the time, they just thought that he was acting a little bit strange after his grandmother's passing. So, in a few panel talks that the LulzSec crew have done, or like the core 6 or 7, they've talked about his change of behavior. But at the time, they didn't think too much of it.
So what's interesting to me was about a week later, LulzSec claimed responsibility for a big DDoS attack on the CIA. Again, kind of escalating the government stuff again. I mean, in a certain way, it almost feels like the whole crew knew that their Lulz ship had sailed, and that some way or another they're probably going to all end up in jail, and whoever's will go for it. And they DDoSed the CIA, and this was largely the work of Kayla. So you mentioned Kayla being mistaken for perhaps a girl that some guys had a crush on, but we know it was Ryan Aykroyd, and his big contribution to the group moving forward with DDoS stuff was he had a botnet of about 800,000 servers that he could kind of unleash on websites to take them down. And so the first DDoS activity I'm aware of in LulzSec was the attack on the CIA in mid-June after Sabu's arrest, right? So at this point, Sabu's involved in all these conversations and feeding this information to the FBI while the group is continuing to escalate their operations against governments worldwide.
Yeah. The other thing I think was that breach as well was they also published a bunch of data from like Senate.gov as well. So they were just all out, let's go after US government assets at this point. So yeah, it's hard to know if they were reading between the lines and knew that it was on their way down and they just wanted to humiliate the US government or not. But it was pretty significant, like going after the Senate, going after the CIA. It's all danger, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, and the whole Senate thing was, the U.S. Congress not long before that made a public declaration that cyber crimes could be an act of war. And so they immediately went and attacked the Senate. Again, kind of inviting attention that perhaps you ought to probably not really want. And then and I believe they defaced the website and it said an act of war, gentlemen.
That's some pretty epic trolling, isn't it?
I mean, Topiary, let's just, let's be honest. Topiary was a meme king of his time. And the sense of humor in all of these ops, and the mustachioed guy with the top hat and the glass of wine, the LulzSec pirate ship that looked like I drew it when I was 4, the Twitter ops. I mean, to be fair, this is an impressive information operation for 6 people to conduct.
Yeah, but I guess they're clearly having a lot of fun while they're doing it, right? And I know that, it's not just for the lulz as it said they were, and we'll talk about that later on, but they were clearly having a lot of fun while they were doing it. Like, it's just obvious by the way they even talk about it now when they're on panel talks and they're reminiscing. Like, obviously, they regret going to prison, they regret their prison sentences, but they were having a lot of fun at the time. There's no doubt about that.
To shorten this up just a little bit without going into all the details, I just want to list a long list of additional victims that we're not going to even have time to talk about to show how prolific these 50 days were. In addition to public television and Sony Pictures and the PlayStation Network and the CIA, and originally News Corp, of course, through hacking Fox.com for the X Factor stuff that you talked about, Ben. They also hacked The Sun and the Times. They hacked Nintendo. They hacked Prawn.com. They hacked Bethesda Software. They did a denial of service against Minecraft and League of Legends and The Escapist and Finfisher and EVE Online and Heroes of the Network. I don't even know what that is. I'm not enough of a gamer, apparently. They stole 62,000 IDs from writerspace.com. They attacked the NHS. They did a DDoS against the Serious Online Crimes Agency, or Serious Organized Crime Agency in the United Kingdom, SOCA. They attacked a bunch of Brazilian government agencies. They attacked Petrobras, the oil company in Brazil. They attacked Jinhuan in China. They attacked the Arizona Department of Public Service. They attacked hackforums.net and stole 200,000 IDs. They attacked the NATO online bookshop. And they stole 500,000 IDs from Battlefield Heroes, another game that I'm not aware of. But, 50 days of mayhem from largely teenagers and young adults with modicum of skills of SQL injection, these types of things. What an enormous amount of mayhem.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, I think, why it's still, I want to say, a household name. It certainly is in a lot of information security, or even information technology as a broader thing. Like, if you work in tech, if you're interested in tech, you've probably heard of LulzSec. They were famous for 50 days and continue to be.
Well, and they had so much fame that, they had hundreds of thousands of followers on social media, and they were covered by the BBC and others in much of their adventures, if you want to call them that, the way they would probably have called it. And they even did a whole phone denial of service campaign. They managed to get the phone number 614 LulzSec in the United States. And they would do denial of service phone attacks against people because so many people were following them on social media. They could publish that phone number and go, call now. First, they phone denial of service the FBI field office in Detroit, Michigan. Then they did a denial of service against the tech support phone number for World of Warcraft. And then the final one that caught my attention and blew my mind for a minute until I made, kind of the lulz and the meminess of all this stuff. They did a phone denial of service against the phone number for magnets.com. And you're like, magnets.com? What on earth were they thinking attacking magnets.com? And it turns out there's a line in an Insane Clown Posse song, What Even Makes Magnets Work, or something similar to that they were just having a laugh on, and just turned their phone number at the magnets.com phone line. And they actually got the guy on the line while they were doing a live YouTube broadcast, topiary. And he's told the guy's like, why am I getting all these phone calls? And they're like, oh, we're just having a laugh, and we've got this phone number and all these fans, and we just turned it at your phone number because of the Insane Clown Posse. And the guy had a bit of a chuckle, and they moved on.
Well, see, it was just for lulz, chat. So no harm, no foul. So, or am I wrong?
Well, I can't say. I mean, the public will have to judge whether the prison terms and the other things that resulted from this were appropriate to the mayhem and the crimes that were committed. But I leave you a little bit to more of that as an expert. I mean, I didn't obsess this time on how many years for this and how many years for that. I did get a little bit obsessed with the idea that it was only for the lulz and that it was all altruism. And in my notes here, I have bullshit altruism. And to put some of this into context a little bit, groups like Anonymous have always claimed to be altruistic. And a lot of the research for this podcast that I conducted was from a book by Parmy Olson called "We Are Anonymous," and I cannot recommend it enough. It's a fascinating read, even almost 15 years on. It's a really great book, not just because I'm in the book. I shared a quote of mine is in the book, but Parmy did a great job of covering this while it was happening and putting it into context from the perspective of the hackers and the perspective of Anonymous. And the term she used in the book early on, referring to Anonymous in general, was ultra coordinated motherfuckery. And I think that really sums up what LulzSec was. It was ultra coordinated motherfuckery. Um, it, it was bizarre. It's hard to judge. It's hard to figure out what it was. Many of the online stories call these people gray hats. I'm not really sure what to think that is supposed to mean.
That's rubbish.
I've been in this industry for a long time, and I'm a little confused by that. But on the other hand, while this was all unfolding, I did have to have a laugh a few times. Their humor was exceptional, and sometimes their victims were hard to sympathize with, and I think that was part of their point. And a lot of it did appear on the surface to be altruistic. I particularly don't have a lot of respect for Hector Javier Manseger, the Sabu, and that being done up for stolen credit cards, and then also upon further investigation, the FBI determined he had an illegal handgun. He had sold 5 pounds of marijuana. He had been buying stolen jewelry, buying stolen electronics. He had charged $15,000 to a former employer's credit card number that he no longer should have access to. He had hacked an online casino, and he hacked an online auto parts store to send himself 4 entire car engines. That one, you got to wonder how they don't know who did the crime when you mailed the car engines to yourself. I'm sure there's more to that story. But, this wasn't entirely altruistic. And almost all of the people involved were done up, with the exception of AV Unit. Do you want to cover kind of what happened to these folks?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot to go on there. Firstly, so let's start with the leader. So as I discussed, Hector or Sabu, he was 28 at the time. He became an FBI informant. He didn't end up serving any sentence whatsoever. Not only that, him and his FBI handler started an information security company together down the track. And they actually have a podcast together as well called Hector and the Fed. So I'm going to say, I feel like he got away kind of scot-free.
He's profited from his crime.
Yeah, absolutely. When I'm not too sure if everybody else it did just as much. So Ryan, who supplied the botnet, he got 32 months in prison for his crimes. Ryan Ackroyd, also known as Kayla, he got 30 months prison for his time. Jake Davis, topiary, he got 24 months, and he was put in a young offenders institute. He was pretty young at the time as well. I think he was 19.
19, 19.
Yeah. And then T-Flow, who was only 16 at the time, he got 20 months suspended sentence plus 300 hours of community service. So again, he was young. He was way younger than everybody else. He was doing a lot of the website management, so managing LulzSec's website. But they all pleaded guilty to their crimes. And of course, AV Unit, who was the other core member, nobody actually knows who he was. Someone on Reddit did an AMA that claimed to be him, and he said that he chose to leave the group once he saw that they were getting a little bit too cocky. They weren't worried about operational security anymore, and he decided to leave. Now, that is Reddit. It may not have actually been him. He claimed that he did the AMA because of the statute of limitations that ran out, and he could now come and speak about those crimes. But all in all, everybody served some time except for Hector Monsegur, who has profited from his crimes. But everybody else seems to still be in technology, working in information security. A lot of them are doing security research anyway. And honestly, having done research, having listened to interviews, watched YouTube videos, a lot of them, they seem remorseful. It sounds like they had a lot of fun, but they're not necessarily proud of what they did. But all in all, it wasn't just for the lulz. They claimed that it was for the lulz. They went on a crime spree for 50 days and then decided to to pack things up. But if you look at it, the heat was there. They announced that they were going to disband after 50 days, but one of the members had already been arrested at that time. So I think that their time was up and they just tried to get off the internet as soon as possible. Thoughts on that, Chet?
Well, I have two lessons I take away from all this. One, Pwn Sauce being the head of an OWASP chapter suggests to me that OWASP might want to do a little DuckDuckGo search or a Kaji search and see if the head of any of her chapters has a name like Pwn Sauce. Not great. Two, AV unit. He left when the group started, and we didn't even talk about this, but a theme before the 50 days were over called Fuck FBI Fridays. And anytime you're in a group of people that decides their mantra is going to be Fuck FBI Fridays, good time to leave. And he did get away scot-free, and we still to this day do not definitively know. Well, we don't know it's a he, but we do not know who they are. And I think that's sage advice. Fuck FBI Fridays usually is an indicator bad things might be coming. So, a couple good lessons there. I mean, the biggest lesson, I guess, for defenders is this looks an awful lot like what we're now talking about when generically, I think, is getting applied the word scattered spider. And I don't think half the things that are being called scattered spider in 2025 actually are. But what it's referring to is a bunch of young people who are actually pretty damn clever with technology and with social sciences and know how to put the two things together. We laugh at what LulzSec did. And while SQL injection is not sophisticated, it doesn't mean that you didn't spend some time and figure out some technical things. And you don't have to be terribly sophisticated, but when you combine the two things together, you can be incredibly dangerous. And the things that are being attributed or called scattered spider, whether they actually are that particular group or not, I reserve judgment on. But it's why that thing, again, is so popular and successful. The hacking of Uber and Electronic Arts and Microsoft and on and on and on that's been attributed to these groups that are using these techniques. I think most recently Marks and Spencer and Co-op and Harrods in the UK, insurance companies in the United States like Aflac are all being attributed to scattered spider. Now, whether that's one group or seven groups, whether it's a loosely affiliated group of ultra coordinated motherfuckery, I don't know. What I can tell you is that is a dangerous combination of things that most organizations are not prepared well to defend themselves against. And you need to be thinking about that when you laugh at the sophistication of a SQL injection attack, or laugh at a meme, or laugh at how your employees might be socially engineered and that won't happen to me, I'm too smart, because it's just not true. And we have to keep our minds open to that.
What a perfect way to close. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I think this episode, there's been a lot to go through. It's a sophisticated timeline. What was the book that you mentioned that's worth the read, Chet? Can you say that again?
Oh, I recommend to everyone Parmy Olson's We Are Anonymous. Please find it at a local bookseller, and at a very last resort, you can buy it on Amazon.
Perfect.
Well, on that, we'll wrap up, and as usual, you can find the video version of this, which includes no video at all, but it is up on YouTube if that's where you like to consume things. So you can find us at youtube.com/@SecurityTake2. Our website's at securitytake2.com. You can email us at hosts@securitytake2.com. And Benny, I think we still have a Reddit thing.
We certainly do. So if you go to reddit.com/r/securitytake2, you can find the show notes and links to our websites there. And if you want to join in any conversation whatsoever with us, you can speak to me there.